Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto and Sasuke became friends at a young age. Will Naruto's paranoia and mental instability draw Sasuke down into madness, or will Sasuke's own demons bring them both into the dark? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 4. Naruto, as it turned out, was a slave to routine. Sasuke found that doing the same thing every day at the same time was comforting to Naruto, and he was more likely to do it if he had at least done it twice. Getting him to attend the ninja academy that first week had been a trial. Naruto had put up some weak attempts to escape his grasp, even going as far as flopping down on the floor and refusing to get up. Sasuke had to drag him out of the apartment, a thoroughly embarrassing ordeal needless to say. Naruto didn't pull that one again. After that, he seemed to resign himself to the outdoors, and had even worked his cleaning schedule around so that now his days started around 5 in the morning, and not 7. Next to Naruto, Sasuke was now the cleanest to be ninja in Konoha, and had heard several of his classmates whisper that both of them smelled like detergent. This both annoyed and pleased Sasuke, mainly because Naruto being around him gave him a completely valid excuse to get Ino and Sakura to leave him alone. Naruto didn't like anyone within 7 feet of him, that included seats as well, so to Sasuke's delight, he was able to hiss at anyone who sat any closer than 3 seats from them, and Iruka-sensei didn't contradict him. Needless to say, Naruto wasn't a favorite amongst the female population of the class, with his shady hood and his bowed head and darting eyes. But Naruto didn't make a fuss in class or outside in general, not wanting to make a scene and have his imaginary enemies notice him, though the girls in class weren't so imaginary. Many other things were going well too, such as Naruto's eating habits. He had refused to eat the soup Iruka-sensei had brought. Actually, he refused to do a lot of things after Iruka-sensei's visit, like moving, for an instance, or answering him when he asked him if he was alright, but he'd been determined to get some kind of soup down Naruto's throat though, so he had gone out and bought multiple cans of soup. And after explaining carefully to Naruto that there was no way they could poison the soup unless they planned to poison everyone in Konoha, and there was no way they could know that the soup was for him, Naruto acquiesced and slowly and cautiously drank the soup. It had gone down so well, in fact, that Naruto now had 1 bowl of soup every day at lunchtime. This meant, however, that they had to return to the apartment during lunch break because Naruto didn't like to eat in front of people, and had whispered that he didn't want anyone to know that he liked the soup or they would poison it. In the few weeks with Naruto, Sasuke found himself becoming quite creative with Naruto's weird habits. He made them run home during the break, and timed their arrival with a stopwatch, and since Naruto was such a night owl, they did most of their training when Konoha was asleep. They jogged around the park at first, and it had been abysmal. Naruto was too weak to do anything more than a power walk in the beginning and for short periods of time as well, but after weeks of repetition, Naruto was able to do a steady jog. His bony arms and legs began to show a bit of definition, and he had gained a bit of weight on some of the more fattier soups he'd managed to get him to eat broth, though that had been a one-time ordeal. Naruto apparently had a rather violent aversion to meat, so violent in fact, that he had bled out of his mouth, having bitten down hard on his tongue. Sasuke had been going to Iruka-sensei for occasional advice, since the Chunin instructor seemed to have taken an instant liking to Naruto, and he had suggested that if he couldn't get Naruto to eat meat, then he should get him protein pills as supplements and maybe more carbohydrates. At his blank stare, Iruka-sensei had drawn up a list of breads and noodles. The noodles had been an immediate failure. Naruto wouldn't even look at the bowl, and ever since the egg sandwich, Naruto wouldn't eat bread. So Sasuke had to be creative, and he'd soaked the bread in Naruto's rice soup one evening until it had turned to mush, and though Naruto had been terribly suspicious, he still ate it. Naruto was a good taijutsu training partner, to Sasuke's secret delight. There'd been the first training episode, when Sasuke had shown him some moves, and had gotten him to emulate them, but when he accidentally hit Naruto, the blonde had given him such a wounded look, he'd thought that would be the end of taijutsu training. But the next evening, when he started the training again, Naruto had begun to quickly evade his moves. Naruto was surprisingly fast, and was so phobic of touch, that he could possibly be a master in the art of evasion. Evasion? Perhaps Naruto was a master of evasion. He evaded questions, he evaded answers, he evaded people, he evaded life. The very apartment was evasion. Sasuke always felt like he had left Konoha whenever he returned there. He felt like Sasuke, and not Uchiha Sasuke, last member of his clan. The only thing Naruto asked of him was that he give him his clothes to clean every day, shut the doors quickly lest they get in, who they were, he'd never know, and to clean up all his messes. Naruto didn't demand that he be great, or smart. Naruto was clearly smarter than he was anyway, and he didn't seem to know or care about why Sasuke had suddenly moved in with him, or if he had any relatives that were worried about him. Naruto didn't seem to know anything more than his small apartment and the patterns on his desk at the academy. And he supposed this evasiveness was exactly how Naruto liked his world, though by Sasuke's standards, it was a miserable world. After a solid month of roommating with Naruto, Sasuke could say that he knew Naruto well enough in fact to see that something was upsetting him, something that made him revert back to not eating, and making a fuss again about going outside. He'd been awakened twice by Naruto talking to himself too loudly, which he hated, because Naruto always sounded like he was talking to someone particularly hateful. Naruto stood in the living room, pale blue eyes focused on the newspapered windows. His pale face held a sheen of sweat, and his breath was short. In his shaky hands was a basket full of his and Sasuke clothes. He normally didn't like washing both of theirs together, but Sasuke was a whole lot cleaner now than when he had first moved in, and he no longer minded. He no longer minded when the place smelled like foreign food, or that Sasuke made noises that he wasn't used to, or that an extra cloth and towel now hung in the bathroom. They had been right. Sasuke wasn't so bad. Sasuke was even nice to him, and didn't hit him unless they were training, and didn't call him a monster even though he knew he was. Unfortunately, he imagined that Sasuke might hit him today, when he woke up. When this was all over, Sasuke would be hitting him a lot, and his eyes clouded over with tears. A shadow, a shape of a man, came in front of window, and Naruto dropped the basket with a gasp, backing up. Another joined the first, and muffled voices drifted through the glass and newspaper. This the place. The voice was hollow, tired, and he imagined that if it had color, it would be a fuzzy gray. Yes, this voice would be an angry red, perhaps streaked with bruising purple. This is where the little bastard lives. Naruto stumbled to the bedroom, shutting it quickly behind him, ignoring Sasuke's questioning grumble as he lifted his head at his entrance. We'll kill them, destroy them, tear their bodies apart, bleed them dry, sprinkle the earth with their souls. Naruto dropped to his knees as visions assailed him. He was so tall, above Konoha while it burned, the feeling of small bodies being torn apart, crushed by his limbs. There was blood in his mouth, blood of hundreds, and he gurgled, crashing to his knees, pulling at his hair so that he could suppress his screams. If the villagers knew he was in here. Naruto. There were fingers digging into his, prying them from his hair, and he looked up with a sob to see Sasuke's frightened face, tormented with confusion. What's the matter? You're pulling out your hair, stop. Sasuke was so much stronger than he, and he was forced to release his hair. Sasuke moved away from him, probably disgusted, and he crawled to his corner, sobbing. He didn't think he could take any more of this. He sat back on his pillow and sobbed, vision blurred by tears, and he could only see a dark blur in front of him before something came over his mouth, and he blinked rapidly so he could see. Sasuke had a handful of paper towels, and he was wiping his mouth, and he realized that he was mopping up blood. Sasuke's face was pinched, dark eyes wide, but he seemed focused on wiping the blood from Naruto's mouth and chin until there was none left, and all Naruto could do was sit there, drained, and watch as Sasuke scrubbed the spots of blood on the carpet with cold water and bleach. He seemed very intent on that too, and Naruto imagined that Sasuke was embarrassed to be with him, which shouldn't have made him any more sadder than he already was, but it made fresh tears course down his face anyway. Sasuke left to toss the bloody paper towels away, but fear that the villagers were still out there spurred Naruto to cry out, "Don't! They'll see you!" Sasuke paused in the doorway and turned to look at him. "Who'll see me?" His voice was empty and unassuming. Naruto drew his knees to his chest and hugged them, staring fearfully at the dark-haired boy. The villagers." Sasuke's shoulders slumped and his eyes rolled in exasperation. "This again? No one's here to kill you, Naruto. How many times do I have to tell you?" And Naruto watched as he angrily stomped away. Naruto dropped his head onto his knees and remained that way. They were echoing through his head, an angry cacophony of visions, blood, and death and so much hate, that he feared he would either vomit it up or choke on it, and he pressed a hand to his mouth to keep from doing either. When Sasuke returned, he had the basket of clothes that he had intended to wash, had apparently showered, and Naruto watched in horror as he put the clothes on. Naruto wanted to protest, but he didn't want to draw Sasuke's wrath upon him, though he knew it was inevitable, and Sasuke was going to be very angry with him in a few minutes anyway. Sasuke stood over him and folded his arms, eyeing him, and realization blossoming in his eyes. "We are going to the academy today," he stated, and narrowed his eyes at Naruto's vehement shake of head. Sasuke's face went pale, his lips turned into an angry white line, but to Naruto's complete surprise, he turned abruptly on his heels and headed for the door. "Fine. Stay in here. All by yourself." The door slammed shut behind him, and soon after, the front door too. Pain bloomed right behind his left eye, flashes of red and black light coloring the vision, and Naruto crawled weakly under the bed. Didn't Sasuke know? All by himself was just going back to normal, going back to nothing. The next few days were lousy for Sasuke. He'd gotten so used to Naruto being with him at the academy, that having an empty seat next to him was not only unnerving, but annoying as all hell too. It seemed, in Naruto's absence, that Ino and Sakura were back to annoying him, and he didn't have Naruto's jumpiness to warn them away with. They kept asking questions about him, wondering if he was going to come back, and clearly hoping he wasn't. Iruka-sensei was also asking questions, and had even volunteered to check up on him, but Sasuke had declined the offer, reminding him that Naruto didn't like visitors. The only visitor he seemed to tolerate was the Hokage, who was too damn cheerful for both their liking. He just didn't know what was up with Naruto these last few days. It was like he had completely converted to the first few days they had met, not going outside, not eating anymore, staying in the room. As a matter of fact, and this gave Sasuke pause as he pulled out the key to the door, Naruto had stopped cleaning. He lifted his head and stared at the door. Naruto had stopped cleaning. Voices caught his attention, and he noticed some villagers down below, a woman, carrying a kimono for the fall festival, which also coincided with the Kyubi no Kitsune memorial service for those who had lost their lives fight the fox demon. It was a festival that he had enjoyed going to, and briefly wondered if he would go again and if it was possible to get Naruto to go with him. Sasuke unlocked the door and entered, a whiff of cleanser comforting him, though it wasn't as strong as it used to be, since Naruto had stopped cleaning. The thought made him nervous. Locking the door behind him and taking off his sandals, he headed for the bedroom. His eyes fell immediately on Naruto. He looked bad. He was curled up the corner, red-rimmed eyes wide, face so pale he could see the veins underneath the skin, and he was shaking badly, as if he were standing out in the cold. His blue eyes fell on him, and they were so full of despair. "They're coming," he rasped, and as Sasuke opened his mouth in exasperation, something entirely unexpected happened. There was a loud crash in the living room, sounding like broken glass, shocking him as Naruto scrambled under the bed. It was probably the most shameful moment in Sasuke's to be ninja career, and he couldn't exactly remember how he had gotten under the bed with Naruto so fast. One moment, he had been at the bedroom door, the next, under the bed next to a silently weeping Naruto. His heart was pounding in his ears, and at first, all he could hear was the sound of his quick breaths. Something hit the walls of the apartment, and both he and Naruto jumped in response. I'm sorry," Naruto gurgled around his sobs, eyes shut tight, but the tears managed to leak through. Sasuke took a deep breath and pulled out a kunai from his hip holster. "Stay here," he whispered, "I'm going out to S-." He was cut off as Naruto's eyes snapped open and a thin hand gripped his wrist tightly. "Please don't leave," Naruto pleaded, and Sasuke shook his head and crawled from under the bed, pulling loose of Naruto's startling grip. "Please don't leave, Sasuke, please." Naruto's pleas were heartbreaking, but Sasuke had to go see what the danger was. Naruto became silent, as he approached the bedroom door. Sasuke eased the door open and peeked out. The window was broken, bits of glass and newspaper littered the floor, and he noticed a large brick and several rocks also littered the floor. "You fucking monster!" A voice shrieked out, and Sasuke jumped, eyes darting to the window. "Come out, you bastard!" Something sailed through and shattered against the wall, and he saw that it was a beer bottle. Sasuke slipped through the doorway and crouched carefully along the floor so he was not visible via the window, and when he came to its side, he peeked out. Quite to his disbelief, and his mouth did fall comically open, there actually were villagers down on the ground, 6 of them, all looking red in the face and royally pissed. They had rocks and broken bricks in their hands, one even had a kunai, and tossed it at the broken window. It missed the apartment entirely, letting him know that this man wasn't a shinobi. But what did they want? One villager was cursing up a storm, tossing out some pretty horrible threats that seemed to please his cohorts, and all the while he used words like monster and demon. Were they talking about Naruto? What could Naruto have possibly done to these men? Sasuke felt the blood drain from his face. Had Naruto been telling the truth, warning him all along? Could it be that there really were villagers after him, trying to kill him? Another rock flew through the window and bounced off the wall, and at last the men seemed to have blown off all their steam, and they turned away and left the complex. Sasuke took a deep breath and called out to Naruto. "They're gone now." Naruto's head appeared at the bottom of the doorway, his face was red and wet with tears, his lips were bloody, but there was relief in his frightened blue eyes. They looked at him, then at the mess in the living room, and his face scrunched up, and more tears came as he climbed to his feet. Sasuke watched grimly as he moved into the kitchen, opened the cabinet under the sink, and pulled out a square plank of wood, a hammer, and some nails. This had apparently happened before. Together, they nailed the wood over the broken window, cleaned up the glass and rubble, and after Naruto completely cleaned kitchen, living room, and bathroom, retired to the bedroom. There, he helped Naruto tape more newspaper to the window, and built up the courage to ask, "Why were they attacking us?" Naruto's face crumbled as he smoothed the newspaper down with bony hands. "Because I'm a monster," he whispered as he silently cried. When that was finished, Sasuke thought it might be nice to try and calm Naruto down, and him too, so he pulled out the 1,000-piece puzzle he had packed, and they began to put it together. And though Naruto actually seemed intrigued by the puzzle, he never stopped shaking, and he never stopped crying. It was as if his tear ducts were on auto drip. Sasuke's fist that rested on his knee tightened. Naruto wasn't crazy, Naruto was scared, because people were trying to kill him. But why? Naruto was so afraid of people his own shadow made him nervous. Rage filled him. Naruto had been alone the last time this had happened. Then shame filled him. He'd been telling Sasuke that the villagers were trying to get him, and he hadn't believed him. Some friend he was. The next day, Sasuke was awakened to shouts, and the crash of brick on wood, and he jumped out of bed quickly, eyes darting around for Naruto. He leaned over and peeked under the bed, and there Naruto was, eyes shut, hands gripping his hair and whispering to himself. Sasuke pulled out his kunai and slipped outdoor, eyes immediately falling on the splintered plank lying on the carpet and the large brick. He peeked out the side of the window and glared at the villagers, the same ones from yesterday, except they had been joined by several others. Sasuke gripped the kunai and wondered if he would be able to hit one of them when quite to his surprise, an umbu popped up, standing on the rails, arms folded across a broad chest as he stared down at the villagers. Sasuke watched in utter fascination as the villagers' faces went from rage to instant fear, and they quickly retreated. Sasuke stared at the umbu's back in awe, admiring the sheer power of his simple presence. It was the most brilliant thing he had ever seen. If he could have that kind of presence, if he could inspire such fear. He leaned down and picked up the wood, and quickly nailed it over the window, not wanting the umbu to see him. After that, he made soup for the both of them, and had to drag Naruto from under the bed. He looked worse than yesterday, his eyes couldn't seem to stay focused, darting about in his sockets. It frightened Sasuke, and he decided that the last thing he wanted to do was leave for the academy and opted to stay. That night, Naruto became violently sick, and began to throw up constantly, so they both spent most of it in the bathroom, with Naruto bent over the toilet. It left Sasuke raw and on edge by the time morning arrived, and the sounds of the fall festival pulling in full swing didn't seem to help Naruto any. Instead, it seemed to make him more crazed. "Please stop," Naruto rasped around a raw throat, cradling his head and rocking back and forth. Sasuke sat on the tub rim, eyes darting between Naruto and the sounds of voices approaching the apartment. "Please just stop," Naruto sobbed. I didn't do anything to anybody. Please don't say that. He was pulling at his hair again, talking to that mean person in his head again. Something hit the door, a voice shouted, and that was it. That was it. Sasuke leaped up from the tub and rushed at the door, pulling out his kunai, and he threw aside the locks, snarling as he threw open the door, because he was too angry to form anything intelligent. There was a man there, his fist raised as if he was about to pound on the door again, his mouth opened in an O of surprise. Sasuke gave another guttural snarl and swung the kunai. The man jumped back, but Sasuke managed to nick him on the neck, and the man backpedaled over the railing and fell 3 stories to the ground. The angry villagers hushed with shock, one rushing to the man as Sasuke jumped on the railing and prepared himself for a jump, but to his surprise, the villagers gathered up the motionless man and retreated as quickly as they had when the Umbu appeared. Sasuke blinked rapidly as the adrenaline drained from him, watching them retreat, and he stumbled off of the railing, taking deep breaths as he backed into the apartment and shut the door. Leaning against it, he laughed like he was laughing for the first time. He felt good. No, he felt powerful, like that Umbu, like he was that Umbu. Sasuke laughed, running a hand through his hair, until he could laugh no more, and Naruto returned to his thoughts. As he headed for the bathroom, he admitted to himself that he clearly felt like he had passed some kind of test, and as he crouched over Naruto, gripping him in a headlock so that he would stop banging his head into the tiled floor, he promised himself and Naruto, to power. To absolute power. Chapter 5. There was blood everywhere, on the walls, on the floor, on the ceiling, on him. It was as if he had bathed in it, rolled around and smeared it all over his body until his very eyeballs were coated. Naruto's eyes rolled madly in their sockets as he tried to avoid looking at the pulsing body parts that littered his bedroom. There was a man's head on the bed, a man with dark hair and eyes, staring at him accusingly. On the floor below the man's head was a heart, perhaps his heart pulsating madly, trying to pump blood through the aortas to arteries that no longer existed. Instead, it squirted droplets of blood onto the already drenched carpet. Across the room, intestines writhed around the bookcases in a macabre dance, and it seemed to move to the same beat as the heart. He wasn't sure if the images were real or fake, but he was sure that he didn't care. He was frightened all the same. There was laughter in his head, and the voices looked out through his blood-coated eyes and roared their amusement, but mostly it was rage. The head on his bed opened its mouth moved, and brown words puffed out, the color of rusted blood, and they floated toward him, wretched he imagined, if he could read at the moment. He was temporarily struck dumb, and the only thing he understood about the words were that they would hurt when they touched him. He was curled up on his pillow, hands forever smashed against his ears, a vain attempt at blocking the angry voices and their malicious laughter, their anger against the walls of his mind, in which they were trapped. Between the terror and pain, random thoughts would come to him, like that it was October, his most hated month, or that he had urinated on himself. He wanted to wash badly, but every time he removed his hands from his ears, it felt like claws were scraping against his brain, and he knew he was screaming something unnatural. A severed hand skittered across the crimson carpet. Occasionally, when he wasn't in so much pain, and the random thoughts seemed to cease, he would find a dark-haired boy crouching before him, a villager. His mind would scream, and he would whimper and wish the unknown villager away. Blackened words would puff out of his mouth, twisted with gray, and he even thought, between screaming and wishing there wasn't a wall behind him, that the boy looked clearly distressed. Then he would go away, and Naruto would return to staring at the severed head, who spit rusted words at him, hating him with his eyes. The boy reappeared in his vision, and had a paper towel in his hands, a wet one, and he wiped his face and mouth, and tried to pull his hands from his ears, but he didn't want his brains to be clawed up again, and fought to keep them pressed to his ears. He wished the villager would go away. He'd heard his family, relatives, and other people in general refer to hell. They'd say, "Go to hell." Or "This is hell," or "I must be in hell," and he hadn't thought much on it, except that hell was apparently an unpleasant place and no one liked it or wanted to go there. So surely, Sasuke reasoned, this must be hell. Somehow, he and Naruto had been sentenced to hell, and there was apparently no date of release. Sasuke hovered in the doorway, staring at his roommate, Naruto, who did not seem to recognize him anymore. They had been roommates for more than a month, they had become comfortable in their routine, and it all seemed to have faded in one moment. Naruto writhed on the pillow, fresh blood smeared all over his sweater and hands from his mouth and the multiple scratches that ran down the sides of his face. His nails had been scratching his scalp raw, pulling out strands of his hair so that it littered the area where he lay. It had been 4 days since he had swung the kunai at the unknown man, and he only briefly wondered if the man was dead, and since then, Naruto had been a mess. He refused to move from the pillowed corner, would not eat, would not clean, he wouldn't even move to use the bathroom. Sasuke had attempted to drag him to the bathroom, but the mere sight of him seemed to drive Naruto insane. He had screamed, a high-pitched keen that had made him leap back in fear. Once he had caught sight of Naruto's eyes, and it seemed that some of the capillaries had popped, leaving his eyes bloody and leaking, and if they weren't constantly rolling in their sockets, they were frozen on the bed, staring at something. It was the reason why Sasuke hadn't slept on the bed since this all began. Then, there were the words, grating and thick, slurred around the blood that gurgled and trickled from his mouth. They were frightening, angry, and often enough, it didn't sound like Naruto. "It's only a matter of time," Naruto hissed suddenly between a whimper, and Sasuke stepped into the reeking room. "We'll be free, it's only a matter of time. Nothing lasts forever." The voice coming from Naruto's bloody mouth was like nails on chalkboard, and Sasuke brushed the goosebumps on his arms as he moved to where the books sat, lining the wall in neat piles. It was the spot he had been occupying for the last 4 days, because Naruto didn't seem to notice him there, only when he was directly in front of him. He'd tried wiping his face and mouth, tried pulling his hands from where they covered his ears and dug into his scalp, but Naruto was terrified of him. "Nothing lasts forever," Naruto whispered again. His bloodshot eyes seemed to follow something along the floor, but Sasuke could only see carpet. He sighed, rubbing his exhausted eyes, and tried to tune out Naruto's constant whimpers as he settled in for another hell-like day. He hadn't returned to the academy since this had all started, too scared to leave Naruto alone in the apartment in case the villagers returned, and he half expected Iruka-sensei to come and inquire about their absences, but he imagined that the Chunin was too busy enjoying that stupid fall festival, in which he blamed for all his current troubles. Right now he could be training, getting stronger, advancing faster than any other academy student, but no, he was stuck inside the apartment, with Naruto, and somehow he just knew it was all the festival's fault. He just didn't know why. "Sasuke!" He was awakened by the sound of his name, and his eyes jerked open, blinking blearily at the blob in the corner until they managed to focus. Naruto was on his hands and knees, bloodshot watery blue eyes darting around the room, looking lost, as if he hadn't a clue where he was. His lanky hair was matted with blood and dirt, his ears and cheeks scratched and crusted with dried blood and scabs. There was dried blood running along his neck and staining his gray sweater along with his hands. He looked like he had gotten in a fight with a girl, a particularly vicious girl. Sasuke sat up with a groan, realizing once again that he had fallen asleep on top of the books. "Naruto?" he replied hesitantly, unsure if Naruto would recognize him after a full week of screaming when his eyes fell upon him, or when he approached. Naruto's eyes fluttered in a very familiar way as he continued to look about the room in confusion. He opened his mouth, and Sasuke could see that his tongue and teeth were coated in blood. "I'll get some water," he muttered, quickly exiting the reeking room and getting a glass of water. As he was about to exit the kitchen, he paused to grab a candy bar. Naruto hadn't eaten in a week, and would no doubt be hungry. When he re-entered the room, Naruto was pulling at the front of his sweater with his index finger and thumb, looking thoroughly disgusted with his appearance. "Here," Sasuke held the glass near Naruto's face, startling the blonde, who blinked up at him then crawled away from the glass. As he moved, Sasuke got a whiff of blood and urine, and he grimaced as Naruto crawled out of the room and headed straight for the bathroom, which would clearly be a relief for both of them. Under normal circumstances, he would crack open a window, but he was leery of that scenario, it not being safe and all. The sound of the shower turning on was music to his ears, and he dragged Naruto's soiled pillow out of the room and into the hamper. He was awash with relief. Things would get back to normal, he believed, as he put the candy bar away and pulled out a can of soup. They would get back to training at nights and studying in class during the day, he thought gleefully as the soup heated on the stove. The soup was happily warmed by the time Naruto emerged from the bathroom in a fresh gray sweater and dark green pants. He wobbled into the kitchen, darting nervous glances at him as he bent over and pulled cleanser out of the cupboard under the sink. Nuh-uh. Sasuke shut the cupboard and dragged a weak Naruto over to the table where the steaming bowl of soup sat. Eat first, he commanded. Naruto blinked and hovered over the bowl before he took the spoon and sipped carefully, eyes moving to the window that was boarded. Sasuke grimaced. He didn't know how he would get it fixed without calling in a professional outsider. We're going to have to get that window fixed. How'd you fix it before? Naruto stared dully at the soup, but jumped when a knock came from the door, and quickly staggered back into the bedroom. Sasuke pulled out a kunai and threw open the door, prepared to put up a fight, and taking a step back when he saw that it was the Hokage. He gave a half bow to the man and stepped back again, allowing the elder to enter the apartment. The Hokage's dark eyes zeroed in on the window and his face seemed to darken. Is Naruto all right? He inquired in a cold tone, eyes still focused on the boarded window. Sasuke resisted the urge to back away some more, scratching his arm and shooting a nervous glance at the bedroom door. He's fine. Some villagers broke the window. Why? Sandaime rubbed his brow and sighed. I suppose you'll have to ask Naruto about that. He glared at the window. I'll have the window repaired while Naruto is at the academy. Where is Naruto? Sasuke swallowed and resisted the urge to look at the bedroom. He didn't want the Hokage to go in there, because it smelled of urine and unwashed body, and he also didn't want him to see Naruto with his scratched, bruised, and bloodshot eyes. Sasuke weighed the odds in his mind. Which would upset the Hokage more, Naruto in the smelly room, or Naruto in the living room? He rushed into the room and dropped down by the bed, reaching under it and grabbing what felt like Naruto's sweater. As he pulled, Naruto grabbed onto the bed leg and gave a very unusual whine. Naruto let go of the bed. He hissed, glancing back nervously. It's just the Hokage, damn it. Let go or he'll come in here. Naruto released the leg as Sasuke pulled him to his feet and pulled his hood over his eyes. Sasuke, holding him by the arm, presented him to the Hokage. The old man looked Naruto over, giving a smile at the small hooded figure. How are you, Naruto? He asked in a kind grandfatherly voice. Naruto's thin fingers began to wring themselves as he stared at the carpet. Fine, Naruto's voice broke around the word, which wasn't very reassuring, and the Hokage's sharp eyes narrowed. He took a step forward, and Naruto's face darted up to look at him, then back down, and that one glimpse was all they needed to see his scratched face. Though he was thankful that Naruto had washed away the blood, his face still looked like someone had taken gnarled wire to it. The Hokage's brows rose and his eyes moved to Sasuke's in question. We were sparring, Sasuke answered quickly, and felt his face redden in embarrassment. Sure, if he were a girl the scratches on Naruto's face would have been believable. He'd seen Ino and Sakura resort to clawing and hair-pulling in a spar. He'd laughed himself sick at the time, but the Hokage didn't look amused or like he even believed him. Your sensei has reported that neither of you have been in attendance at the academy for over a week. At his words, Anumbu moved into the doorway, frightening Naruto, who fled back to the room. Sasuke stared at the Umbu. It was the one from the other day, the one that had frightened the villagers away. He wore the mask of a turtle and had broad shoulders, very broad, unusual for a ninja, and Sasuke thought that he must do more taijutsu and strength training than the other Umbu he had seen. Sasuke. He looked back at the old man. The Hokage was staring quite intently at him, and he resisted the urge to cringe. Naruto's been sick the whole week, and people have been throwing things at the apartment and shouting, and it's been driving us crazy. It wasn't safe to go out. His tone bordered on accusatory, and the Hokage gave a very exhausted sigh in response, and it was clear to Sasuke that it was going to be his only answer until he could get Naruto to say something that didn't seem crazy, though he imagined he would believe anything Naruto claimed, seeing that he had been telling the truth this whole time about the villagers wanting to kill him. He'd believe Naruto next time. Hours later, the apartment was smelling like it had been bombed with bleach, to Sasuke's satisfaction, and he stood in a towel, having had all his clothes removed, and watched as Naruto put the cleaning supplies away. The bedroom had been scrubbed from wall to floor, the bed had been stripped, and the books wiped down. He had even helped Naruto repaper the windows, even the boarded one, and had found the action strongly reassuring, though he couldn't imagine why. Now all they were waiting for was all the clothing and linen in the washing machine. Naruto returned from the kitchen looking bizarrely satisfied, with his scratched face and frail disposition. Sasuke pulled him back toward his cold soup and watched over him until he was greeted with an empty bowl and Naruto green around the edges. When their clothing and linen finished, they both headed back to the room and he helped Naruto make up the bed, an awkward affair being that he had never made up a bed before and Naruto didn't seem to like wrinkles or pockets of air. He managed to completely complicate bed making, down to weird things like the corners must be turned in triangularly, and other inane techniques. When the clothes were either worn or put away, Sasuke opened up his box full of the family jutsu scrolls he had brought along with him when he had moved in. "What do you know about jutsu?" he asked the hooded blonde, who was back to his completely scrubbed corner, staring down at a book. Naruto's eyes darted up to him and he gave a small twitch, which he later realized was Naruto's attempt at a shrug. Jutsu are often the product of channeling chakra to a certain part or parts of the body through the inner coil system, which is to chakra as blood vessels are to blood and then manipulating it to create an effect which wouldn't be possible otherwise. If the inner coil system malfunctions or is blocked in any way, it is impossible to perform any jutsu at all. Jutsu are divided into 3 categories: taijutsu, body techniques, genjutsu, mind techniques, and ninjutsu, techniques that rely on sources beyond those. Besides these main categories there is another, more specific category, funjutsu, sealing techniques. Besides being either ninjutsu, taijutsu, or genjutsu, a jutsu can also be hidden, secret. Hidden jutsu are jutsu passed down from generation to generation within some clans. Right, Sasuke blinked several times, stunned that he had managed to say all that in almost one breath. He moved from the bed and sat down in front of his roommate, separating the scrolls from the roll. "These are katon jutsu that my family sort of specialized in, well after the Sharingan." Naruto stared down at the jutsu, then glanced up at his eyes when he mentioned the Sharingan. "Technically anyone can get these, but we were particularly good with them." Sasuke stared down at the jutsu scrolls, feeling depressed after feeling so much relief that Naruto was back to normal again. "Do you have it?" Naruto's voice interrupted his dark thoughts, though it came as a wisp of a voice. He looked up from the scrolls in surprise. "Do I have what?" Naruto swallowed and smoothed his hood down over his eyes. "The Sharingan." Sasuke felt his face flush, felt the embarrassment flood through him. "No," he growled, then wished he hadn't when Naruto's body flinched. He rubbed his eyes roughly with the back of his hand and glared down at the scrolls. "But it won't be long till I have it. I'm an Uchiha." To this, he met silence, and he glanced up to see that Naruto was staring down at the scrolls. "What about you?" Naruto didn't respond, but he knew that the blonde was listening. "Were your parents ninja? Did they die on a mission or in the Kubadesh?" He was cut off when Naruto made a loud hiss, and it seemed as if pain rippled its way under his skin. His bony hands flew up and covered his face, and there seemed to be a strained-out squeal as the blonde rocked back and forth on his pillow. Sasuke just sat there in front of Naruto with his legs crossed, picking at a fingernail. It was weird, but he wasn't upset, and he wasn't mad. He'd just wait this out, like everything else when it came to Naruto, waiting, patience. He was learning a lot of that. He was hoping that Naruto's family had been a clan of some kind, a clan with Kekkei Genkai that would be useful to them. "I know nothing of them," Naruto's torn voice came muffled from behind his hands, as he continued to rock. "Maybe they died, maybe they just didn't want me. Most likely that. Nobody wants a monster." The next day he dragged Naruto out of the house, 1 because he wanted to get some training time in, and 2 because the Hokage had sent out a man to fix the window, and he knew that Naruto would freak out if anyone was in the house besides the 2 of them. Naruto seemed even more terrified to go out than the previous times, so much that he kept a firm grip on the blonde's forearm all the way to the training grounds, lest he make a run for it. Everywhere he looked, he saw people cleaning up from the festival. The ground was littered with confetti and balloons, paper cups and plates, bottles and paper lanterns. The villagers had the look of lingering satisfaction on their faces as they swept up the products of their celebration. And Sasuke had the feeling that he was never going to go to that festival again. They went to the training grounds, and Naruto was back to power walking instead of the light jog Sasuke had worked him up to. That week of craziness had sapped much out of both of them, and so they walked, and while they walked, Sasuke showed Naruto all the hand seals, and watched in silent satisfaction as Naruto mimicked each seal after he showed him. He was lucky in that Naruto wasn't a winner, and didn't complain once it was clear that a situation was out of his control, and so he did what Sasuke told him to do in silence, with darting watchful eyes and open ears. When they returned to the apartment it was to a fixed window. Naruto was scandalized and was very quick to newspaper it up. While he did this, Sasuke cleaned the area outside of the apartment, which wasn't littered with confetti, or balloons, but with broken glass from bottles, pieces of brick that hadn't made it through the windows, and some rocks. He cleaned it with lips pressed tight in anger and taut muscles trembling with pent-up rage. When he was finished, he stomped back into the apartment and headed into the bedroom, spotting Naruto in the corner, sifting through the jutsu scrolls. "Why?" he snapped, startling the blonde, who dropped the scrolls and immediately hit his face with the hood. Sasuke stalked over to him and pulled the hood back roughly, glaring down at his frightened roommate. "Why were they saying those things about you? What did you do?" Naruto's terrified eyes darted around the room while he wrung his fingers in distress. I. You what? Just tell me. I won't be mad, I swear." Naruto looked up at him with watery eyes. I'm a monster," he whispered, and seemed to wait for his condemnation. Sasuke threw up his hands in frustration. "You've said that before, but it means absolutely nothing to me. What, did you kill someone's babies or something?" To his complete disbelief, Naruto nodded, staring almost emptily at his legs as he whispered, many people." Sasuke took a step back and bent over at the waist so he could see Naruto's face, which was white and a bit shell-shocked, like he couldn't believe he had admitted this. "How'd you do that? You don't know any jutsu or dash." "We were above them," Naruto interrupted, and his head darted up and he stared up at Sasuke like he was barely seeing him. "We were above them, and they were ants to us are ants to us." His weak voice seemed to grow strength, and then Naruto was standing, still staring at him, and Sasuke felt a chill run through him as Naruto continued. "They tried to hurt us, but we crushed them with our paws, and we crunched them with our teeth, and swept them away as dust with our tails. So many of them, so small." His eyes began to follow something around the room, and Sasuke looked about to see what he was looking at, but there was nothing but the two of them. Naruto's body gave a spasm and his blue eyes rolled in their sockets. He slumped down onto his pillow and cradled his head in his small thin hands, groaning softly. Sasuke sat back on the bed and stared slack-jawed at the boy in the corner. This sounded eerily like the recollection he had heard from a cousin who had been speaking of the Kyuubi attack. Sasuke turned and stared out into the living room, seeing one of the newspapered windows, remembering the drunken, angry words of the villagers. He looked back at his companion. Do you mean that you're Kyuubi no Kitsune?" A shudder ran through Naruto's body at the name, and Sasuke swallowed. Was it true? Was he sharing a room with a nine-tailed fox demon? His eyes ran over Naruto's frail form. He didn't seem like a demon, he'd seen more aggression in kittens. But what if Naruto was more aggressive? What if this was merely some type of ploy to make people think he was weak? Sasuke scratched his chin, and thought harder. If Naruto was the fox demon, that meant that every one of the villagers knew about it, even the Hokage. Why would they let him live, having killed so many villagers and ninja? It didn't make sense to let something that powerful and evil wander about the village unharmed. He peered at the object of his thoughts and watched him pull the hood back over his head. Maybe they couldn't kill him, maybe they had no choice but to let him coexist. Better the enemy before you than behind. There was an infinite amount of possibilities sitting right here in this room with him, frightened of him, willing to do whatever he told him to do. He gazed at glimpses of Naruto's face, and for the first time noticed that the scratches along his cheeks and ears had all but faded, disturbingly fast for a regular person. Sasuke got to his feet and saw Naruto tense in response. "Well, come on. We have to eat lunch." They returned to the academy the next day, watched under the curious eyes of the students, and the very relieved eyes of Iruka-sensei. They sat in their seats a distance away from all the other students, and kept to themselves. That week they learned the Bunshin no Jutsu, and they both succeeded on the first try, though Naruto's wavered and disappeared after a few seconds. When they were alone, he made Naruto practice until he could keep it up for 10 minutes, then they would run home for lunch, and return when it was over. And they had started an uninterrupted routine once again. Naruto cleaned house early in the morning, waking Sasuke up to take his clothes. Sasuke was learning the skill of falling back to sleep immediately while being naked. When he was fully awake, he'd stop Naruto so he could eat, then it was a jog to the academy. There, they learned the basics of being a ninja, Naruto soaring to top of the class when it came to written exams, but seemed reluctant to do anything when it came to practicals. When it came to sparring, Naruto refused to be partnered up with anyone unless their last name was Uchiha, pissing off many of the other students. When the day was over they headed for the training grounds, where they both practiced the katon jutsus that he had. The day ended with dinner for him but none for Naruto, whom apparently stopped at lunch when it came to eating. Anything beyond that and he was barfing in the toilet. Then it was bed for him and the pillow for Naruto and the cycle continued and it was a good one. The idea came over him when he had gone out to pick up an order for several kunai he had commissioned. Naruto was in the bedroom talking to himself and unwilling to go out, because it was Saturday, and people were less busy, he'd said. When they were less busy, they noticed him, and Naruto didn't like to be noticed. A good trait for a ninja, Sasuke thought in satisfaction, and then he had passed the Uchiha compound, and thought faded. Trees and vine grew over the walls, a clear sign that the compound wasn't being taken care of. He'd been the last one to leave the place, and he couldn't ever imagine returning there. But his feet took him to the gates, and he peered beyond the dried-up vines then clung to the metal and stared at the empty houses. Dust had gathered on the porches, leaves had collected in the gutters, and yet, everything was as he had left it as they had left it. It was so quiet here he glanced up at the trees and heard no bird song. It was a dimmed place, empty with no one but ghosts and memories. No one would probably ever come here again. A light bulb went off in his head, and Sasuke left the gate and ran all the way back to the apartment. He slammed the door shut behind him and rushed into the room, a grin on his face, though Naruto looked pale and frightened. "I've got it!" he gasped, and Naruto stared up at him with large eyes. "We should move into my place. It's dash." Naruto was already shaking his head rapidly and vehemently. "Let me finish. It's safe over there. No one goes there, and it has walls and fences. We could train all we want and you don't have to worry about some villager showing up." Naruto had stopped shaking his head, but his eyes moved about the room nervously, as if he expected it to dissolve around him. "We could move in the middle of the night, everyone would still think you are here, and even if they find that you are gone, they won't know you're at my place." For once, Naruto was giving him a speculative look, which was kind of creepy. "It'll be an easy move." Sasuke looked about the room. All they had were clothes, books, and some scrolls. They didn't need to bring any furniture along since his house had everything still in it like all the other houses except for bodies. There were none of those. He hesitated. Should he tell Naruto about what had happened to his family? He shook his head and grabbed his blue traveling pack. It was best not to tell Naruto anything what he didn't know couldn't harm him. He wound up doing most of the moving, being that Naruto was no help carrying things that were heavy, and he was too jumpy to pay complete attention to where they were going, so Sasuke left him behind and moved all of Naruto's books into his old room, which was much larger than Naruto's. The next night he took all of their clothes, and made a return trip to turn off the refrigerator and remove the remainder of the food in the kitchen. And last, he retrieved Naruto, who looked like he was close to having a nervous breakdown now that his room was completely empty except for the bed. It was 3 in the morning by the time they reached the gates for the last time, and Sasuke was about to drop from exhaustion, and yet, he was excited. They'd be able to train without Naruto becoming distracted. They'd be able to see what abilities Naruto possessed if he really was the fox demon. This was the perfect place. The moment they approached the place, Naruto wanted to run. The air stank of death, misery, and pain, so much pain, and it all seemed to hover in the air like a miasma. He stopped as Sasuke opened the gate and beckoned him in, but he shook his head. Sasuke's hand snapped out and he grabbed him, and he swallowed a scream as he was yanked inside and the gate shut ominously behind him. "Yes," they breathed, and their satisfaction ran through him. There were many houses, all sitting along a road that seemed to wind its way through the compound. The place seemed more like a mini village inside of a bigger one. There was movement in the corner of one of the houses closest to them. Naruto stood there, eyes transfixed as a groping hand dug into the dirt by the house, and pulled itself forward. The hand was connected to a bloody arm, and the arm wriggled and convulsed against the dirt until a head was revealed, a man with dark hair and eyes, mouth agape and full of blood. He gave a gurgle, his black eyes rolling madly in his sockets until they focused on him, and Naruto trembled as the man writhed forward in the dirt. His throat revealed to be sliced open, his entrails dragging beside him, and he inched toward Naruto, who wrung his fingers and watched in terror. "Come on," came Sasuke's voice, and he gasped and jumped as the dark-haired boy gripped his bicep and pulled him along, eyes focused ahead, a look of anticipation in his eyes. "This is where I and my clan used to live. The great Uchiha clan." They passed by a child with similar features to Sasuke, holding a woman's head in his hands, sobbing, with a kunai lodged in his brain. Naruto averted his eyes and stepped closely to Sasuke, who acted like he couldn't see them. Why would Sasuke take him here? Why would he do this to him? Was he punishing him for being a monster? Was this where he felt he belonged? Tears welled up in his eyes, and he darted away from the man that stood in the middle of the path, a deep gash running from shoulder to hip. His dark eyes followed Naruto as he and Sasuke passed. Sasuke was frowning at him, glancing around, eyes passing over the man, but apparently by his shrug, not seeing him. He saw women in windows holding headless babies, and men on porches, hobbling on bloody stumps. They all stopped to look at him. They stopped in front of a large house, and he saw that Sasuke hesitated a moment before entering. "This is where we're going to live from now on," he muttered, and Naruto saw that he was pale. They entered the house, and Naruto choked. There was so much hate and anger here, so much of it, that he imagined it had spread throughout the compound and had consumed everyone in its path. A woman came into view, a pretty woman with soft dark eyes and lovely black hair, and a kunai sitting deep in her breast. She looked at Sasuke, opening her mouth, and it was like a black cavern, endless, and a roaring wail came from her, so loud, that Naruto covered his ears and screamed. He staggered away, crashing into a wall, feeling hands on him, but he continued to scream, pressing his palms tightly against his ears, his head seeming to split with the pain, hearing nothing but the woman's roar. And then, silence. Naruto opened his eyes, and he saw that he was in a different room, a room with posters on the walls and toys littered on the floor. He stared emptily at one, a blue dragon with large eyes and a long, almost comical tongue. It lay on its back, staring at the ceiling. His eyes drifted up, and he saw Sasuke sitting on a larger bed, and looking a bit grey, kind of like on the evening he had met him. Naruto wiped his eyes with a trembling hand and realized he was sitting in a corner, a dusty corner, a contaminated corner, and he knew that he would be cleaning all morning. This house was big, and it was dirty, filthy. He pulled his legs under him and eyed the door, half expecting the woman to come in. Instead, Sasuke spoke in a quiet, haunted voice. "I bet you can sense what happened here, huh?" He had what looked like a ninja action figure in his hand, and he moved its arms and legs as he spoke. "Everyone knows what happened to the Uchihas." He put the ninja in a pose, legs spread, hands together in mock jutsu stance. "My brother was the best Uchiha my clan had ever produced, the smartest, fastest, most powerful, he was so cool." Sasuke stared at the ninja, then positioned its head to the left then the right. "And then he killed everyone." And with his flat words he pulled the ninja's head off and let it slip through his fingers. Naruto watched it bounce to the floor then roll towards him. They began to murmur through his head, causing an immediate ache as the head rolled to a stop near his knees, the painted eyes fierce and defiant. Naruto cradled his head in his hands and gave a small whimper. He was supposed to be safe here. Sasuke said it would be safe, that no one would harm him. But Sasuke lied. Sasuke lies. Everyone lies to him, and he shouldn't have expected anything otherwise. Chapter 6. He was in a dark place, a black void, floating, but not alone. No, he was never alone. Couldn't he ever recall being alone? They were always with him, as they were now. Eyes appeared in the void, large eyes, the eyes of a giant, red and black, blue and purple, green and yellow, and so many more that they took up the space in the void, filling the darkness. Naruto curled into a ball, made himself as small as possible, but still they saw him. "You are weak," they boomed, and Naruto flinched, pain lancing up his spine and settling behind his eyes. But you have been given an opportunity that we will not let pass us by. We will be powerful again. There was a great deal of delighted laughter at this. You will not fail us. It felt as if the eyes were so close that they were touching him. He understood the threat, the price if he failed, eternal torment, eternal misery forever with them. Wake up! Naruto's body jolted, and his eyes flew open. He blinked rapidly as the headache descended upon him, and he sat forward on his pillow and surveyed the room. It was much larger than his own had been, with a bigger bed and a long bookcase taking up one side of the room. When Sasuke had finally dozed off, Naruto had placed his collection of books in the case, and had been pleased to find that they all fit. And while Sasuke slept curled up under his blankets, he picked up the toys and placed them in the large chest that sat in another corner of the room. He pulled out his bag full of cleaning supplies and wiped down every surface as quietly as he could without waking the dark-haired boy, who did not stir once. Taking a deep breath, Naruto picked up the bag and opened the door, fear rising in him as he peeked out into the dark, cold hallway. He half expected the woman to be there, waiting for him to come out, but the hall was empty and silent, except for the occasional creaks of the house. He swallowed nervously and stepped out, slowly shutting the bedroom door behind him, breaking out in a cold sweat as he slipped down the hallway and entered the large living room. It had much more furniture than he liked to see, fancy furniture, and all of it coated with dust and filth. Naruto sighed. This would take all morning, and with the headache he had, the blonde took another deep breath and got to work, washing the wooden walls, wiping down the couches, scrubbing the carpets, polishing the tables and lamps. When that was finished, an hour's worth of labor, he slipped into another room, which turned out to be a very big kitchen. He moved to the kitchen sink and opened the cabinet beneath it, and was pleased to see an array of cleaning material already available to him, because no doubt he would run out with such a big house. He grabbed a few bottles, straightened up and turned, and gasped in horror as the woman from yesterday stood behind him. The bottles slipped from his arms, crashing to the linoleum as he backed up into the sink. The woman, who was probably Sasuke's mother, simply stared at him, her dark eyes filled with tears, her face lined with grief. Then she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving him shaking in front of the sink, pale and sweaty, heart pounding in his ears. And they laughed. After 10 minutes of shaking, he worked on the kitchen, mopping the floor, cleaning the stove, polishing tables and chairs. When he was finished with that, he drank from the faucet, quenching his thirst. Then he moved on to another room connected to the living room, but froze in the doorway when the stench of blood assaulted his nose. This room also looked like a living room, except it seemed more serious, with a longer table and many chairs, and farther into the room was a very large desk. On the floor before the table was a very large stain, a stain he understood all too well, and standing on the stain was a man, dark of hair and eyes, with lines running along his face putting him somewhere in his 40s. He also had a kunai in his chest, but he was also missing an arm. He stared at Naruto dispassionately before speaking in a cold voice. "Have you come to take our souls, demon?" Rusted puffs came with each of his words. Naruto wrung his fingers as he stood in the doorway, shaking his head in reply. The man stared at him a moment, before replying, "You think you can hide in the body of a child? I can see your glowing red eyes." His dark eyes bored into his own, dead, lifeless, but at the same time, angry. "You cannot fool me." Naruto backed out of the doorway and shut the door, staring at it before taking a deep breath and turning his back to face the living room. The house had to be clean, but not even he would dare clean that one. He moved on to several other rooms, a few bathrooms and hallways, a stairway, and one very chilling, isolated room filled with ninja apparel and a bed. This room had almost been as bad as that other room. There was a muted anger here, it seemed to fester the very air, and Naruto was left to wonder if all the bad things that happened in this little village had started right here in this room. He moved through that one quickly before leaving. He was relieved to say that Sasuke's mother and father were the only two he had come across. When he returned to the first floor, it was to see that Sasuke was awake and making breakfast, still looking a bit pale, but also determined. Determined was bad, because it meant that Sasuke was probably going to make him do things he didn't want to do. He rubbed his eyes, which felt swollen by the force of his headache, and put the cleaning materials away. It was 7 in the morning, and it had taken him 4 hours to clean the majority of the house minus the room with the stain and Sasuke's father. "We leave in an hour," Sasuke reminded him as he placed the bowl of cold soup in front of him. Naruto sighed and picked up the spoon but made no complaint. There was no need to do such a thing. Sasuke would only force him out of the house, and fighting back would only be wasted energy. After they ate and showered, Sasuke helped him newspaper every window in the house, and there were many of them, and he was doubly grateful for all the back issues Sasuke's father had kept, because he was doing double layers, being that he didn't want all the massacred Uchiha to look inside, which some of them were doing as he taped down the newspaper. Sasuke made no comment as to why he was shaking so much. Then they ventured out to the academy, and he stuck very close to Sasuke while all the Uchiha lifted their heads and watched him go, some eyes full of nothing, others full of despair, horror, pain, or most common, wanting. What they wanted, he could only imagine. At first he was struck by his own stupidity, at returning to the Uchiha compound. What had he been thinking, coming back to this place, where his whole life had been ruined? He was sure he would crack in the first night alone, back in his own bedroom, back to all the memories. But he had awakened at one point, and seen Naruto putting his books in his bookcase, and all the fear seemed to ease away. Naruto was part of his new life, in which his old one couldn't touch, and Naruto's indifference to his tragedy was reassuring. He didn't need pity, or for someone to constantly bring it up or try to heal it for that matter, and he could assure himself that Naruto would do none of these. Naruto would not talk about it at all, not because he was tactful or sensitive, but because talking meant someone would pay attention to him, and Naruto just didn't like to talk, which was fine with Sasuke. And it turned out, as time passed, that though he was back where he had started, things were still different, and though Naruto was jumpy, and stared at weird things, he also went outside more without Sasuke having to pull him out, or glare threateningly. They trained when they wanted, day or night, without the worry that someone would approach them except for the Hokage, who was very surprised by their move. But he was also very pleased by Naruto's progress. The blonde no longer looked like he was starving, had grown a few inches, and actually managed to look at the Hokage without fear. That didn't mean he talked to him. A conversation with Naruto consisted of yes or no, unless, and this was the only exception, if he was giving a textbook-style explanation, and this he didn't do very often because Sasuke had stopped asking him if he knew things. He just assumed Naruto did, and if he didn't, well, Sasuke couldn't tell. Naruto was a very good training partner. Reluctance and frailty aside, it appeared that Naruto was the type of person that when he did things, he did them right. So though he knew Naruto had no wish to be a ninja, that didn't stop the blonde from taking training seriously. He fought Sasuke during taijutsu training, and he was sleek and fast, incredibly evasive and leaning toward the fluid movements of Tai Chi. His jutsu abilities were at the standard level, and he could perform all of the katon jutsu Sasuke could, and his kunai tossing was accurate and deadly, now that he had the physical strength to make the kunai stick. So it wasn't much of a surprise when Naruto quietly mentioned the use of a katana. The man had approached him while he sat under a tree with Sasuke, sweating from their taijutsu training, and feeling the ache in his muscles, and from spots where Sasuke had hit him. The sun was peeking at them through the leaves, and he wished he were inside where it couldn't bug his eyes. He was already feeling very nervous, not because he was outside, but because it was quiet. Everything was quiet. They had not said, or laughed, or roared, in the last hour, and this frightened him. He had been hearing them all his life. They had made their presence known to him the moment he could understand the concept of thought or an inner voice. They had always been there, and yet, they were silent. He could only conclude that they planned something horrible for him in the same way they forced Sasuke upon him, so when the man with a large chunk of his skull missing staggered toward them, he was not surprised. Sasuke was oblivious, as usual, staring out at some of the houses, unaware that the man was there. He wore a Chunin's vest, and his hitayate hung comfortably around his neck, seeming completely normal despite the exposed brain. Dangling in one hand, was a katana, worn from use and looking quite comfortable. He stopped several feet from them, and Naruto looked up at him, ready to leap out of the way if the man attacked, which he no doubt would, being that he was a villager, and they always wanted to see him suffer. "You're a small one, eh?" The man commented congenially, puffs of rust escaping his mouth. Naruto swallowed and glanced at Sasuke, who started to sharpen a kunai, looking relaxed and content. He looked back at the man, who smiled happily, which was alarming, because none of the other Uchihas had ever smiled. He couldn't imagine why they would have a reason to. I saw you and Fugaku's boy sparring, and you look to me like the kind of boy who should be getting a sword. He leaned forward and peered down at him, and Naruto leaned back. You're not very strong physically, but you got precision, and you got speed. Go get yourself a sword and I'll show you some moves since I ain't done shit for 6 effing months. He waited for Naruto to reply, and just when he decided not to say anything, they stirred, and he knew he would have to do what they wanted. Naruto nodded rapidly, and the man smiled. Good. I'm Nabeshin. I'll see you sometime. And strangely enough, his gaze hollowed out, and he seemed to lose interest and simply drifted away. Naruto wiped his brow and glanced again at Sasuke, who was inspecting the kunai he was sharpening. Sasuke! He whispered, and the other lifted his head and turned questioning dark eyes upon him. Naruto averted his eyes, instead staring at Sasuke's shoulder. I would like to train with a sword. A look of keen interest flashed through Sasuke's eyes, and he turned and gazed toward the houses. That's interesting, he commented, and got to his feet. Naruto stood up and quickly followed him as he made his way through a winding path between houses, pausing at intervals with a slight frown, before turning down one corner, until he approached a square house with the distinct scent of metal. Sasuke hesitated at the door before stepping in. The house was actually an armory, the walls lined with spears, cudgels, katana, nodokis, poles, kunai, shuriken, and axes. Sasuke stepped up to one of the walls and pulled down a short-blade katana, about the length of his arm, give or take a few inches. He handed it to Naruto, and as he gripped the worn gray handle, noticed that it wasn't as heavy as he had thought. He carefully swung the blade, watching how the blade arced through the air, and saw out of the corner of his eye Sasuke picking up another, almost identical katana. We can train together, Sasuke said, swinging the blade with more force and carelessness than Naruto dared. What made you want to learn the art of the sword? Naruto shrugged and smoothed down his hood. His eyes found a dark smear on the wall, and he quickly gazed about, searching for the blacksmith, hoping that he wasn't still in the room. Together they exited the armory, Sasuke admiring the katana and the sheaths they had confiscated. He noticed, as things seemed to go, that the Uchiha were most active during nightfall, which was no big surprise as scary stories went, and even though he was terrified to go out, they gave him such a headache that he was all but forced to seek out Nabeshin. He was putting ninja stealth to use, and he hid behind trees, or water heaters, benches, and behind forgotten laundry on hangers to avoid the bloody, wandering Uchiha. He often found Nabeshin wandering around a building, looking agitated, and he looked upset every time Naruto approached him, and he could only reason that something about the house upset Nabeshin greatly, and he couldn't understand why Nabeshin would return there every night if the place upset him so. But Nabeshin was an excellent teacher, very patient, and though his head leaked and his brain sat exposed to the elements, he showed Naruto the proper way to hold the katana, to sheath it, and how to stand. He never touched him, and Naruto never made an attempt to make physical contact. The very thought made his skin crawl, mostly because he didn't like when people touched him, and barely tolerated it from Sasuke. After a few hours of lessons, Naruto would return to the house to clean, and run from Sasuke's mother, who sometimes roared throughout the house, and he had awakened Sasuke several times with his screaming. Sasuke dealt with this in his usual way, which was to drag him back to the room and stand around and wait until he could produce coherent thoughts again. He never asked him what the matter was. After a day spent at the academy, Naruto would show Sasuke what he learned from Nabeshin, and though Sasuke was mystified as to where he had learned the techniques, the dark-haired boy simply believed that as the nine-tailed fox demon, he would know these things. Actually, the idea that he may know things that Sasuke didn't seem to intrigue the Uchiha greatly, and he often asked what else did he know. These questions often excited them too much, enough to pain him and send him to his corner, and often when things got that bad, Sasuke would leave him alone, and eventually he stopped asking. But Nabeshin's lessons were proficient. Sasuke had a natural talent for the blade, and both of them trained until the blade felt like a mere extension of their arms. They knew each other's moves, and they fought each other into a standstill or until Naruto got tired and gave up, which frustrated Sasuke to no end. Sasuke didn't like it when Naruto surrendered, and often yelled at him for this weakness. Naruto didn't much care, as long as Sasuke didn't strike him for it, which thankfully he never did outside of training. But Naruto always expected him to. Always. Haruno Sakura was very excited today. Today, all her years at the Ninja Academy would pay off, and she would be taking a final exam and move on to be a genin. This was a moment, in a series of moments, that she had been waiting for, and she just knew that after she passed the exam, she would be teamed up with the coolest, handsomest, strongest, ninja of their class. The top rookie academy student, Uchiha Sasuke. She blushed in the mirror and drew her brush through her hair for the 100th time until it absolutely gleamed. She had tried to imagine what being on a team with him would be like, how much potential she could bring, how many missions they would complete, how much he would see that she was the coolest kunoichi around. She stepped out of her house and headed down toward the academy. She knew that she would be on the same team as he, but she couldn't figure out who that third member would be. But she knew one thing that made her not worry: it wouldn't be Uzumaki Naruto. Her teeth clenched at the thought of his name. She absolutely hated Naruto, and she wasn't the only girl that felt the same. Naruto was the reason that none of the girls could get close to Sasuke, because apparently Naruto didn't like anyone within 10 feet of him, in all angles, and since he was always with Sasuke, no one ever got close to the gorgeous Uchiha. As a matter of fact, ever since Naruto had shown up, Sakura could only recall one time when Sasuke wasn't with him. If one was absent, both were. The girls liked to think of Naruto as a leech, clinging on to Sasuke, always taking up his time and attention, so that no one could ever speak to him. Some of the boys had made crude comments before that Naruto was Sasuke's little girlfriend, but that joke had faded when Sasuke beat the boy up in the bathroom pretty badly. She'd heard Kiba say that Naruto had just stood by and watched. She could imagine it, and shuddered at the thought of Naruto's eyes. She hated those red-rimmed, shadowed eyes. When they fell on her, they always seemed to be accusing her of something. Naruto always made her feel like she had committed a crime, and she couldn't stand it. What had she ever done to him? And sometimes, when she got too close, and Naruto would move closer to Sasuke, the dark-haired boy would give her such a look, like she was the bane of his existence, and how dare she make Naruto uncomfortable. How she hated Uzumaki. And then, of course, he'd had to take her spot academically. So not only was he taking up Sasuke's time, he also had to be a genius as well. She'd seen his work, his neat penmanship and his superior textbook-like answers. She'd seen Shikamaru send him fascinated looks, no doubt intrigued by the hooded blonde, who never spoke, even when addressed by Iruka-sensei and Mizuki-sensei. This was often a comical event in class, because although Iruka-sensei had long ago stopped asking Naruto questions, Mizuki-sensei seemed intent on getting answers from Naruto. And no matter how vehemently he asked, or slapped his hands down on Naruto's desk, the hooded blonde would remain immobile, forever staring at his desktop. One time, Mizuki-sensei had gotten so fed up with Naruto's insolence, that he had reached out to grab the blonde's face, but Sasuke had jumped up and grabbed his wrist, and had given him a nasty glare. The tension had only been defused when Iruka-sensei returned to the classroom to see the standoff. Needless to say, Naruto still never spoke to him, and they all had talked of it for many days. She supposed what bugged her the most was that not only was he good academically, but when it came to taijutsu and ninjutsu, Naruto was good. She and many others had often stopped to watch Sasuke and Naruto spar, and it was marvelous. Sasuke moved with power, a punch or a kick filled with force, precision and grace. He was always an offense fighter, while Naruto was the opposite, fluid and light, quick on his feet, and often redirecting the force of Sasuke's punches and kicks. They mirrored each other in a way that said they fought often, so that they never really scored each other, since they apparently knew each other so well. This, of course, bugged her. What was the likelihood that they would both end up on the same team? She didn't think she could compete with Naruto, but she wouldn't worry. They never placed two geniuses on the same team. As she stepped into the academy, she immediately spied both boys, standing in a corner, both heads bowed close together, as if they were speaking. She couldn't see Naruto's face, because his blonde bangs and hood covered most of his face, but she could see some of Sasuke's face, and he looked downright unhappy. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, and she shrank away from the rage in his eyes. Sasuke looked pissed. Naruto did not look up, which wasn't uncommon, but he did put a hand over his eyes and squeezed his temples with his index and thumb. It was something she had seen her mother do when she had a headache. Yesterday everyone had been talking about the shocking scene that had taken place outside, and she shot covert glances at the hooded blonde. What had Sasuke done to him? For a second she paused on the thought, why would she think Sasuke had done anything to him? She had heard the terrible screaming. But why was Sasuke so mad? He had been living in a world comprising solely of him, and Naruto Sasuke would admit this, that they seemed like the only living things in a world of ghosts. He hadn't been paying too much attention to what was going on around them, that time was passing by, birthdays had come and gone without notice. The world outside the Uchiha compound had become a blur, almost intangible except for days at the academy, or when he needed to stock up on supplies. There was him, there was Naruto, there was training, and cleaning, and keeping Naruto from killing himself all week during the fall festival. There were newspaper windows, all-nighters, and patching up cuts and bruises. There were katana to sharpen and chakra to mold. There was forcing Naruto to eat, and waking up to have his pajamas taken, and perfecting jutsu. There was complete silence, and the lack of conversation. There was his world, consisting of him, and Naruto. And then Iruka-sensei had announced the genin exam, and it was as if he had awakened from a perfectly acceptable dream, the kind where you wake pissed because it was way better than the waking world. In his mind, those were the worst dreams, and Iruka-sensei had crushed it like a cockroach. Though the idea of moving up in his ninja career should be a happy thought, it was clouded over by the realization that they would be moved into teams, and there was no guarantee that Naruto would be placed with him. And by the gray cast of Naruto's skin, the blonde had arrived to the same conclusion, probably before him. There had been the sound of all the other students, and they chattered in excitement over Iruka-sensei's calls about reviewing material, and it was as if he was seeing and hearing them for the first time. He had lifted his head and surveyed them, seen kids he used to talk to bouncing in their seats, bragging about their potential. All the girls were crowded together, squealing at one another, and a few glanced at him in excitement. Sasuke had turned back to stare down at his desk, and realized that he mirrored Naruto, who had not once looked up. Naruto was instead staring down at the desk in horror, face going from gray to a nasty shade of yellow, very alarming, and Sasuke had quickly asked to be excused. Iruka-sensei had been about to ask why, but he had caught a glimpse of Naruto's face and had allowed them to leave. Naruto threw up breakfast in bathroom, and then proceeded to hug the toilet, shaking and staring into the bowl. "I won't go out there," he rasped, and when he looked up at him, Sasuke had seen his eyes look completely wild. He knew that look, it was the same look he got during the fall festival, crazed and unfocused, his eyes jittering in their sockets. He felt dread course through him. "Not out here!" He had hissed, and tried to pull Naruto away from the toilet, but the blonde clung to it like his life depended on it. "I won't go on team alone. They can't make me." Naruto started to shriek, and Sasuke was alarmed to see that his nose began to gush blood. Naruto released the toilet and dug his hands into his scalp. "You can't make me!" He started to scream. "You can't make me!" Sasuke felt a presence behind him and spun to see Shikamaru standing in the doorway, brown eyes staring in alarm at the crouching blonde, who was now pulling out chunks of his hair. "I won't go, I won't go!" Naruto was wailing, and Sasuke quickly wrapped both arms around the blonde and dragged him out the stall while he continued to shriek. He dragged him out of the bathroom, aware that Shikamaru was still following him, and he took a second to pause and glance back at the worried boy. "He's just having a moment," he called over Naruto's screams, feeling flecks of blood splatter his face, and he quickly continued to drag Naruto away from the academy just as he noticed several students and Chunin appear at the doors and windows. "Should I get a sensei?" Shikamaru offered, still following, wincing as he saw Naruto's nails run over his whiskered face, immediately drawing more blood, that wasn't already pouring out of his nose, mouth, and scalp. "No," Sasuke huffed as he struggled not to fall over as Naruto writhed in his arms, his legs almost tangling with his own. "Just leave us, you're making him crazy." Shikamaru stopped and stayed back as he struggled on, stopping only once to keep Naruto's hood over his head as the villagers stopped to stare in shock as they passed. Naruto's blood was now running all over Sasuke's face, and soaking into the neck of his shirt, and he was surprised Naruto hadn't started clawing at his face. "I won't go." They can't make me. Naruto continued to scream. They can't make me. The progress had been slow and taxing, and Naruto's screams were starting to attract even more attention. Pursing his lips, Sasuke had dragged Naruto into an alley and quickly slammed the blonde's head into the wall, cutting his screams short with a choking sound, and the blonde went limp. Sasuke had then carried the bloody blonde all the way back to the compound, leaving him in a very guilty, very foul mood. A very foul mood. That's it for part 2. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.